The CrossFit athletes need individualized weights that adjust to their needs. And this is a key to coaches to create or have different relations between movement to individualize with percentage of the 1RM.
Hi, Alejandro. It's my pleasure to have you on Evidence Strong Show. If you could briefly introduce yourself, that would be awesome.
Nice to meet you, Alex. First of all, thanks for your invitation. I am Alejandro. I am living in Madrid now. I finished my bachelor studies at 2019, and afterwards I started with my Master of Science. In 5 years, the worst pride of CrossFit was in science, because all over the world, I think that maybe you know some people that practicing CrossFit or attended a CrossFit box, and it's like so crazy. But like researchers or like coaches with an evidence, I think that we need a good practice, a good individualization, and a good parameters to start with this type of training, because I think that it's an amazing training but have some problems because it's a mix of gymnastics, weightlifting, endurance in workouts that mix all these components, and we need evidence about the volume, the intensity, the duration, and what happens below this. And this is my mission. My mission is with my thesis that is at the end to answer different questions about CrossFit topics and try to get CrossFit as a sport more similar to weightlifting. For example, in weightlifting, the athlete know intensity, volume, and is all individualized to their capacities. But in CrossFit, it's like standardized movements, standardized weights, and maybe it's not so good for participants of CrossFit, for CrossFitters. That is all. I am a coach, first of all. Second, I am a researcher. And third, I am a beginner professor in the European University of Madrid.
Excellent. So you bridge the research and practice together for the benefit of sports. So we love it here in Evidence Strong. And today we'll be talking about your study looking at predicting thruster, 1 repetition max in thruster from the clean and jerk, 1 repetition. So let's start with why this study.
Really, this study was not in our plan of thesis. It's outside our plan of thesis. But this plan have 2 or 3 steps. It's like the acute effects of different distribution workouts, like unwrap amount for time, the difference between individualized barbell weights or standardized barbell weights like RX weights. But we have a big problem. The problem was that when we wanted to start a CrossFit periodization with individualized movements, we only can now 3 movements, because the participants of this study have to perform back squat, maximum repetition, clean, maximum repetition, and clean and jerk, maximum repetition. The problem is that the thruster is the movement most repeated in CrossFit workouts, and there are no evidence about relations between other main movement like clean or like squat and the thruster movement, because it's a movement novelty. Okay, if we wanted to start this program and we have 2 or 3 workouts of our periodization with thruster movement, we need a relation between the clean and jerk and the thruster to predict the movement and not spend our time with athletes calculate the 1RM of the thruster. And this was the reason. We need a relation between the clean and jerk and the thrust.
Awesome. So that is the reason for the study. Now, how did you go about designing the study? So what was the protocol?
The participants have to attend their habitual CrossFit boxes, and they have to write, and we have to measure the descriptive measurements. Here is a relevant point, because the experience practicing CrossFit, gender, and the body weight and height are values that at the end of the study, the readers had this study, we perform a cluster analysis and we create different profiles depend of the 1RM and the height and the body weight. And afterwards, I think that it's better to discuss this question. After descriptive data, they have to perform an standardized warm-up, general warm-up, and after this warm-up, and a specific warm-up. The specific warm-up was the same for clean and jerk and for thruster to avoid discrepancy. The thruster and clean and jerk perform the protocol of Bachelet and Earle. That is the same protocol that the NSCA guidelines to predict the one repetition maximum is 50%, 60%, 80%, 93%. I try to get 1 PR, one personal record. And between this 1 PR, they have 3 minutes of rest. And this was the protocol in the clean and jerk and in the thruster. And the clean and jerk and thruster had a random order, not is ever first clean and jerk and afterwards thruster. And these movements have to get 72 hours of rest between testing for our study. And of course, the coaches and the researchers have to say if the movement is a good repetition, or is not a good repetition, ensure do the proper technique and avoid mistakes with these movements. If spectators doesn't know the movement of thruster, because it's possible that the weightlifters or coaches of weightlifting TV channel, the thruster is a movement that started with the barbell in the rack position. In the thruster, the movement is not since the floor normally, and the athletes have to perform a full squat below the parallel, and afterwards in the concentric phase of the triple extension, they have to end the movement with an overhead movement and the elbows extending. And they must not perform this movement without with a stop between the shoulders and the overhead movement. It's only a movement in the concentric phase of the squat and the movement overhead with the elbows extended. And the clean and jerk they don't have to perform a full squat, for example. They have a power clean, and after they have a benefit of the plyometric phase during the split jerk. That this is not the same the thruster movement. The movements have some similarities, but many different.
Right. Could we go through participants? Who did you end up getting for the study?
Okay, for this study, we know that CrossFit is attended for participants of different years, of different level, strength, and was so interesting that any participant with more than 3 months of CrossFit experience and more than 3 days per week have the possibility to include in our inclusion criteria. And we have different experience, and the experience was organized classification depending on 24 and more than 24 months of experience, like experienced CrossFitters, and less than 24 months of experience. And of course, difference between gender. We have in the study 4 groups. These 4 groups are experienced women, beginner woman, experienced men, and beginner men.
And how many participants altogether?
72 or 73, I don't remember exactly, 72. We need over 20 participants in every group. And it's interesting because this study started in Spain, in Albacete, it's a city in the south of Madrid, in our box, and following in other box on Spain, but finishing this study in Munich with my international stay with the Bundeswehr University group.
So the participants were from Spain, but the research team was between Germany and Spain.
Yeah, the research team was a mix between Spain and Germany, and the participant is 90% Spain and 10% of Germany to complete the sample.
Awesome. Okay, 4 groups, beginners and advanced, females and males. So 4 groups there. You did the testing, 2 separate sessions, random order, thruster, 1 repetition max testing, and then clean and jerk, 1 repetition testing. And then you had all this data. What happened then?
The correlation and the relation with all the participants, not separated in 4 groups, was amazing because it was 97 or 98, I don't remember exactly. But when we study other manuscripts, other studies with clean and jerk and snatch or other movements, it's 0.92, depends on the sample, depending if it's experienced athlete or beginner athlete. But our study was 0.98 correlation of person, and it's extremely high. And the duration was similar with all the participants, with the 72 participants. But when we separate the different groups, we find similar results, but with difference. This difference depends on the gender, or if the participant it's a high experience in CrossFit and weightlifting movements, or a lower experience in CrossFit and weightlifting movements. Exactly, the group with a high correlation and regression was the experienced men, but the other group with a high correlation and moderation was the experienced woman. But the difference between experienced and beginners not was so high in the men group, experienced men and beginner men, but between experienced women and beginner women was bigger difference. Not so difference because beginner woman is 0.83. It's high, but not extremely high, but it's substantial difference. And in the discussion in this manuscript, you can search different answers about these questions. Maybe the male CrossFit athletes normally can supply the problems with the technique, with the level of strength in the upper limbs. But normally, the girls or weightlifters, we found that the level of experience and the mastery technical, it's a very big difference with their counterparts beginners, because women don't have so muscular mass in the upper limbs, but with the improvement of the technique and the correct movement are able to increase their efficacy and efficiency in their movements. And maybe this could be the reason because between experienced men CrossFit and beginner men CrossFit, notice a big difference between this model regression and this correlation in clean and jerk and thrust, but when the woman compares with other women with less experience or less level of weightlifting or CrossFit practice, we found a bigger difference. Also, any athlete or any coach can use this model prediction and this formula to estimate their 1RM in the thruster movement, because 0.83 to 0.97 is a model relation with high strength, extremely high, okay? And it's so useful for coaches and athletes.
How would you use these equations in coaching practice?
I think that the future of CrossFit is individualizing the training for every athlete, not for every high-level athlete, for every athlete that attended the box. Not standardized weights in the workouts, in the movements, because this type of training is creating two groups of athletes in CrossFit boxes, the responders and the non-responders, because it's standardized weights. The CrossFit athletes need individualized weights that adjust to their needs. And this is a key to coaches to create or have different relations between movements to individualize with percentage of the 1RM. For example, Greg Everett in their manual have a lot of percentage for different movements, or the Professor Soriano have different percentage for overhead movements, and this is so useful, and this is essential information for coaches and for prescribing individualized weights in CrossFit. Not only in the strength part, of course, in the workout, in the work part.
All right. So what I'm hearing is that the training in CrossFit, it's scalable, but it is not individualized in a sense that weights are not, the weights are not adjusted to the current level of each athlete at the box. And that's what you're trying to change with your study. The now having prediction equations the coaches have, or the athletes can calculate where the maximal repetitions are and scale from the actual numbers instead of the RX number.
Yeah. And this is only a part, I think, because CrossFit is not only weightlifting or basic movements in strength. It's gymnastic movements that have different levels, and it's endurance movements. And endurance is so easy because we have different devices in our race, and it's very easy to individualize with your heart rate. So, for example.
Okay, I have a question about thruster and clean and jerk. So, from my perspective, clean and jerk is quite a technical movement. Thruster is too, but as you mentioned before, it can be masked a little bit with the strength. So, athlete that is incredibly strong will have less trouble executing thruster, whereas in clean and jerk, even strong athletes will have trouble if their technique is really, really poor. So, how that will influence the prediction equations, you think?
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think that it is the same that I comment with the experienced woman and beginner woman, and of course with the case of experienced men and beginner men, because normally in the thruster movements, men with a high level of strength is able to push overhead the barbell with a heavy weight, but when you tested to this athlete in a clean and jerk, the technique have a lack and is not a big difference. The key for the technique, I think that is the difference between clean and jerk and thruster, because thruster is a movement with a demand of strong, high demand of strong, and in other part, the clean and jerk have the split jerk, and the split jerk is a deep and ripe timing, an eccentric phase, and the accommodation phase, and the concentric phase explode, and of course the split position of the feet. Sorry, and I think that the big difference between the 1RM in thruster and the 1RM in clean and jerk is the level of technique that maybe men are able to establish sometimes with the strength in the thrust. Now we have a reference to our study to say that the thruster is the X% of the clean and jerk, and we now have evidence say that it's a good relation and a good correlation for the percentage. But our idea is that this question have a transfer to all the box of the works to try to individualize the barbell weights with different formulates and with different model regression like the Professor Soriano, Greg book, all the other studies, like right, the relationship between clean and jerk and snatch, between a squat, front squat, back squat, etc.
That's awesome. All right. Do you want to bring it all together and have take-home message for coaches from your study? What should they take?
My advice is that measure their athletes. Afterwards, try to have a reference for one of these athletes and try to individualize inside the work in the gymnastic movement, attending to their characteristics. In the weightlifting movement, normally in CrossFit workouts, we have 3 or 4 movements a barbell and with the same weight. And this is a problem of this question. Ever coaches have to select the weight with the movement, with the limited movement. The limited movement is the movement that athletes are able to raise less weight. For example, a limited movement is an overhead movement, not a deadlift, because there are a big difference. And they have to individualize with the movement of the overhead, with the overhead movement. And afterwards, a Polar Garmin device or a different brand to try to, today is a day of low intensity, today is a high intensity day, train high intensity every day. Arnold said, this is for coaches. Yeah, the athletes have 2 days high intensity days, but have to participate in low intensity days and have a ondulatory periodization.
All right. We have 2 short questions to finish. The first one is, what is your favorite lift?
And in a sedentary world life, I think that it's essential. And in weightlifting movements, snatch. Of course, snatch is combination of technique, mobility, and strength. I love snatch, and I think that there are so beauty in a snatch with a proper technique and a big weight in a weightlifting competition.
All right. And the last question would be where people can find you if they want to be up to date with what you're doing.
Okay, research date is a good option. Alejandro Oliver I'm in Instagram, Alejandro.Oliver is other channel that is so interesting. And of course in my email, aoliver@umh.as.
Awesome. Thank you, Alejandro, so much for today. And see you next time, I guess.
Maybe, why not?